Living in medieval Europe was like walking under an invisible shadow. There was a fear that gnawed at people's minds, that kept them awake at night, and that they could feel, breathing down their necks, even in daylight. This fear did not come from one single source. It seeped from every corner of life. Knowing that disaster could knock on the door at any moment filled the lives of everyone, from peasant to noble, with anxiety. Famine was a guest almost every generation knew. Too much rain in the summer would rot the crops. Too little, and the earth cracked and harvest burned. Farmers watched the sky with anxious eyes, reading every cloud and every sign of storm of dread. Just a few weeks of bad weather could destroy an entire year's food supply. When winter arrived and the granary stood empty, many peasants had to face the cruel reality of hunger. The sight of children with swollen bellies and elders wasted away by weakness became common in village squares. To survive, people often mixed straw, roots, and weeds into flour to bake their bread. Plague struck suddenly, erasing even the healthiest lives an instant. The Black Death in particular could sweep from village to village, from city to city, claiming hundreds, even thousands of lives in just a few weeks. People did not know what caused such diseases. Some believed they were God's wrath. Others thought them the tricks of demons or evil spirits. When the plague arrived, neighbors feared knocking on one another's doors, and the dead were often left unburied in the streets. Church bells tolled endlessly for the dead, and a heavy silence settled over towns. War was another constant in daily life. Petty conflicts among nobles spelt disaster for peasants. Fields were pillaged by soldiers, livestock driven away, and barns emptied, though farmers never held a sword. They bore the heaviest burdens of war. Young men were forced into armies, leaving behind women and children defenseless. Smoke rising into the sky each morning was often a sign of fresh devastation. Yet, beyond all these visible disasters, there was something even more terrifying. The unknown for the medieval mind. Nature was still full of secrets, often seen as a hostile force. At night, the ominous sounds from a forest, the howling of wolves, or the groaning of wind through the thatched roofs of cottages reminded people of the devil's presence. If a child burned with fever and died suddenly, if a cow stopped giving milk, or if crops withered without reason, people believed the cause was not natural but supernatural. In this dark atmosphere, people searched for explanations for the calamities they endured. For what is unseen is always the most frightening, and so an enemy took shape. Witches, they became the vessels of collective fear, seen as both ordinary and extraordinary. Often it was the old women living alone on the edges of villages, the healers who worked with herbs, or simply those whose behavior seemed unusual who were marked as targets. A lingering gaze could be seen as a curse, a whispered word as a spell. The belief in witches was not just a legend, it was a face given to society's fears. To make sense of their suffering, people chose scapegoats, pointing to those they accused as guilty. This was not only a rational fury, but also a desperate search for meaning. And so, on cold, medieval nights, whispers spread through village squares. People asked, who will cause the next disaster? And slowly, all eyes turned toward the most vulnerable. In medieval Europe, as harsh as winter, as merciless as war, and as deadly as plague, there was fear. And this fear would for centuries condemn thousands to be branded as witches, tortured and consumed by flames. In medieval Europe, the church was not only a place of worship, but also the very center through which people perceived the world. Rain, harvest, disease, or war, all were explained as the will of God, and the words of the church were accepted without question from the pulpit. The church constantly reminded people of the devil's presence and of evil lurking in wait. Sin was not simply a mistake against God. It was portrayed as a snare, a doorway through which the devil could enter. This belief gave shape to an invisible enemy, and the idea of the devil seeped into every moment of life. The sermons of the church were often filled with vivid and terrifying examples. Priests, whether speaking in the village square or within the dim stone walls of great cathedrals, described the devil as though he were a living figure. They detailed his cunning, the tricks he used to ensnare the human soul. The devil was not merely a creature confined to hell. He was portrayed as a constant threat, moving through daily life, leading people into sin. Thus, an ordinary illness, the sudden death of livestock, or even an unexpected storm could easily be seen as one of schemes. The church's depiction of the devil deeply shaped people's imagination, especially for illiterate peasants. The devil took visible form to frescoes, stained glass windows, and stone carvings of churches. A horned figure, half human and half beast, a fiery creature or a grotesque-faced demon. These images etched themselves into people's minds, leaving no doubt as to the devil's reality. The church also taught that the devil threatened not only individuals, but entire communities. The sin of one person could bring disaster upon a whole village. Thus, someone's transgression was not seen as a private matter. It endangered their neighbors as well. This belief led to constant mutual surveillance, where even the smallest fault grew into something viewed as a communal crime. Fear was no longer just a personal anxiety. It became a shared paranoia that bound entire societies. The devil described by the church was not only an enemy, but also the source of every unexplained misfortune. If a child was born deformed, if a sudden epidemic swept through or crops failed, people believed. This is how the devil has entered among us. This way of thinking kept communities under the grip of an invisible but powerful fear, while at the same time reinforcing the authority of the church. For the only way to be safe from the devil was to obey the church, God's representatives on earth. For the medieval mind, sin was not merely an individual failing. It was a crime against God's order, an invisible wound that threatened the entire community. Every sin had a price, sometimes paid in the soul of the sinner, sometimes in calamities that befell the whole village. In their sermons, priests often warned that sin was as the doorway to the devil. These words wrapped themselves around daily life, making even the smallest action feel like a choice made under God's watchful eye. For peasants, sin was not limited to great crimes like adultery or theft, to be distracted during prayer, to miss Sunday Mass, to eat meat on a fasting day, or even a harbor jealousy toward a neighbor. Any of these could lead the soul into the devil's snare. People constantly examine themselves, seeking purification through confession, yet fear never left their hearts. What if God does not forgive me? What if my sins bring ruin upon my village? The church skillfully used visions of hell to keep this fear alive. The stories of sinners writhing in eternal flames heard during sermons painted vivid scenes in the minds of villagers. Red flames, screaming souls, the chain and the damned. Each description pushed people toward repentance and closer obedience to the church, for no other institution could save them from such a dreadful fate. Out of this atmosphere, the fear of collaborating with the devil grew. The church taught that the devil not only tempted souls, but sometimes entered into pacts with humans. These pacts, described as exchanges of one's soul for wealth, beauty, power, or knowledge, made people suspicious of anyone who suddenly prospered, who possessed secret knowledge of herbs, or who displayed extraordinary skills. All such differences might be signs of a hidden bargain with the devil. Thus, the fear of witches deepened within society. A woman living alone, gathering herbs in a forest at night, offering cures, or simply behaving unusually could quickly be suspected of working with the devil. The link between sin and the devil turned private failings into a communal threat. In this way, ordinary fears evolved into collective panic, laying the groundwork for the great paranoia that would fuel the witch hunts. In medieval Europe, people built a world woven with prayers and rituals, a shield meant to protect their daily lives from invisible enemies, since it was believed that the devil and witches lurked everywhere. Many actions that seemed ordinary were in truth part of a spiritual defense. The very first act upon waking was prayer. Even children, before opening their eyes, would kneel and whisper, "May God protect us from evil today as well." Farmers would trace the sign of the cross on the soil before ploughing, and women would cross themselves over the bread dough before kneading it, for it was believed that the devil attacked at the weakest moments at dawn between sleep and wakefulness, or during the preparation of food. Homes were guarded with sacred symbols. Holy water was sprinkled on thresholds, crosses carved above windows. In some villages, people hung thorny branches or garlic at their doors, convinced this would keep witches from entering. These symbols were not just matters of belief, but had become daily habits woven into the fabric of life. Churches, too, constantly organized rituals to ease the fears of the people. Beyond Sunday Mass, villagers often washed with holy. They were also a way for the community to hold tightly together. Individual methods of protection were equally common. Mothers hung small crosses or medallions of saints around their children's necks, hoping to guard them from evil spirits. Farmers planted crosses in their fields to shield the harvest from the evil eye. In some regions, newborns were kissed on the forehead with holy water before sleep, and pages from the Bible were placed beside their cradles. Yet, despite all these measures, people never felt entirely safe. According to their beliefs, the devil could creep in at the most ordinary and unexpected moments. A woman brewing tea from herbs to heal a sick child could easily arouse suspicion among neighbors. In this way, efforts to protect life and the fear of witches became intertwined, inseparable parts of everyday existence. For peasants, the world was a stage filled with invisible forces. A man was not only ploughing his field, baking his bread, or raising his children. He was constantly battling evil and striving to secure God's protection. And every candle lit, every prayer whispered, every sign of the cross made was seen as a small victory against the shadow of the devil. In medieval Europe, witches were at first nothing more than shadowy figures from legends and folk tales. Old women living in forests, healers who used herbs or solitary individuals, drew little more than passing notice at the edges of society. But over time, the teachings of the church, the fears of the people, and the upheavals of society transformed these figures into terrifying enemies. A child falling ill, an animal dying, suddenly a ruined harvest. For the people, such misfortunes had to be the work of a supernatural hand. When no rational explanation could be found, eyes turned toward those who stood apart. Widows without children, elderly men or women living alone, or those seen wandering at night became easy suspects. People believed witches had made pacts with the devil and used his power to harm others. In some regions, there was a belief in tangible marks of witchcraft. Blemishes or birthmarks on the body were taken as a devil's mark, undeniable proof of being a witch. Likewise, if livestock in the village suddenly fell ill or misfortune struck after someone passed a woman's door, it was seen as evidence of a witch's curse. Witches were not only instruments of evil, but also the embodiment of society's fears. They were said to whisper in the dark, sour milk, sicken newborns, and invade men's dreams with nightmarish visions. In truth, every witch story was a reflection of collective anxiety. Hunger, disease, and famine were beyond human control. But when a witch was found, the people could at least place blame on a tangible culprit. Moreover, witches were believed to disrupt the social order. They were accused of damaging crops, drying out fields, spreading illness, and sowing discord among neighbors. Thus, the witch was not only an individual threat, but also a menace to the entire fabric of society. The Church elevated the concept of witches from folklore to a theological threat. From the pulpit, priests declared, "Witches are the brides of the devil," defining them as soldiers in a war against God himself. A witch was no longer just a danger to the village, but a direct challenge to divine order in the eyes of the people. This made the witch hunt into a sacred duty. The Church's influence went beyond sermons. Priests warned communities against witches, and clerical testimony was often treated as evidence in trials. The idea that witches are servants of the devil became so deeply rooted in the public mind that in some places, accusing someone of witchcraft became almost a reflex. Rumors circulating among villagers fueled the fear of witches. Women lighting fires in the forest at night, black cats vanishing without a trace, strange screams echoing in the darkness. All of these were seen as proof of their existence, especially during times of famine and plague. Such tales reached their peak. People believed disasters came directly from the curse of witches, and so a collective hatred toward them grew stronger. Some records claimed that witches held rituals, met secretly with the devil, kidnapped children, and brought misfortune to entire communities. These stories not only reinforced fear, but were also used in courts as evidence of guilt. In truth, the fear of witches was a way for villagers to make sense of their helplessness. Hunger and disease could not be explained away simply as fate. People needed someone to blame. Witches became the most convenient targets. They were not only imagined as threats to individual lives, but also as invisible soldiers undermining the unity, safety, and faith of the community. From the perspective of social psychology, the fear of witches was a kind of collective defense mechanism. Society chose a target in order to make sense of uncertain disasters and uncontrollable forces. More often than not, this target fell upon innocent individuals who were declared guilty so that the psychological order of society could be preserved. Thus, witches ceased to be mere shadows of folklore in the dark nights of the Middle Ages. In the eyes of the people, they became a real threat. Their names began appearing in village squares and castles, and even in court records. They took their place at the very heart of life as the most powerful embodiment of fear. This threat weighed not only as a physical danger, but also as a spiritual and psychological burden pressing down upon society. In medieval Europe, peasants were often helpless against the hardships of life. Famine, epidemics, drought, or sudden disasters were inseparable parts of daily existence. Primitive farming methods and harvests that depended entirely on the whims of nature kept peasant survival in a constant state of uncertainty. A small drought, a few weeks without rain, the spread of disease or a plague of insects could doom an entire village to hunger. Epidemics, especially fast-spreading diseases like the plague, created terror and panic among peasants. Lacking medical knowledge, people could neither understand the causes of deadly illnesses nor find solutions. Every child who died suddenly, every cow that fell sick, every crop that withered heightened the community's collective anxiety. In such a chaotic environment, people began searching for a concrete culprit to explain their misfortunes. In the midst of fear and despair, They imagine an invisible force or a conscious enemy responsible for their suffering. This search became more often than not an irrational but psychologically unavoidable reflex. Peasants sought to personify the causes of disaster in the form of supernatural power or a hidden foe, and this paved the way for witches to emerge in the public imagination. The rigid social structure of the feudal system also intensified these fears. The oppression of the upper classes, heavy taxation, and inequality in land ownership kept peasants under constant stress and anxiety. This economic and social pressure made it easier to blame neighbors or vulnerable groups for calamities. Elderly women, widows, midwives, or folk healers, those who stood outside societal norms, became natural targets for such accusations. Thus, the belief in witches in medieval Europe was not born solely from supernatural fears, but was also a product of economic, social, and psychological conditions. In order to make sense of their helplessness and to explain events beyond their control, people turned witches into visible scapegoats. This process laid the groundwork for fear to become a social tool and for the rise of the witch hunts. Medieval peasants often felt powerless in the face of natural disasters and epidemics. When drought came, the fields withered, crops burned, and people face hunger. Infestations of insects, sudden outbreaks of disease, or the death of livestock created an uncontrollable chain of misfortunes for villagers. In such moments, simply saying, "It is fate," was not enough. People sought ways to explain and endure their tragedies. The outcome of this search was a need for a tangible culprit. By personifying disasters as a work of a hidden enemy, people tried to preserve their psychological balance. When a harvest failed or a child died suddenly, suspicion quickly fell on those who behaved differently within the community. The old woman, the solitary healer, or anyone whose actions seemed strange to the village became the bearer of blame. Thus, witches emerged as the visible representatives of invisible catastrophes. This mechanism of assigning blame was not only the product of fear, but also a way of protecting social order. Finding a target in times of uncertainty and disaster seemed to reinforce solidarity among villagers and limit collective panic. At the same time, it excuses people from their own helplessness and inadequacy. The disaster is not our fault. It is the work of a witch. Such thinking lightened the psychological burden of the community. Yet, this also made innocent people targets and paved the way for witch hunts. The tendency to find someone to blame in the wake of misfortune reinforced both social hierarchy and traditional order. Once a scapegoat was chosen, fear and anger were no longer directionless, but focused on a single figure. In this way, witches became both a tool for maintaining social order and the concrete target of collective panic. Women as targets. Women were the most vulnerable group in this process. Widows, elderly women living alone, and those on the margins of the village were often perceived as both different and threatening. These women lived outside the control of men, made independent decisions, and defied traditional norms, traits that made them prime targets for accusations of witchcraft. Midwives and folk healers were also frequent suspects. Their medical knowledge and use of mysterious herbs and remedies were icily associated with witchcraft because people could not understand their healing practices. They believed these women possessed supernatural powers and blamed them for misfortunes. Childbirth, with its frequent risk of death or complications, often turned into grounds for immediate accusations of sorcery. Social and economic factors also played a role. A widow living alone could own fields and sustain herself without family support. Such independence, combined with envy and prejudice, made her vulnerable to accusations. Their knowledge and skills, especially in medicine or herbal remedies, made these women both feared and resented. Moreover, women who behaved differently socially could threaten the delicate power balances within the village, turning them into personifications of the community's fears. Those who defied traditional roles, acted independently, or maintained unusual relationships with neighbors were seen as both a social and spiritual danger. The targeting of women did not arise solely from individual prejudice, but from a convergence of economic, social, and cultural factors. Economic independence, medical knowledge, social difference, and collective fear all combined to brand innocent women as witches. In this way, witches in medieval Europe were not just a legend, but a concrete result of social structure, fear, and bias. Life in medieval villages was marked by constant suspicion. Daily hardships and uncertainty meant that even small disputes, misunderstandings, or unusual behavior could quickly transform into accusations of witchcraft. The tight-knit, confined structure of village life made constant observation of one another unavoidable. Everyone knew each other, but everyone also questioned one another's secrets. Social paranoia grew, especially during times of crisis. In the face of famine, plague, or sudden disasters, suspicion became a tool to explain the unknown. If a neighbor's fields yielded better crops, if their family remained healthy during epidemics, or their children seemed unusually strong, such differences were immediately linked to secret powers or witchcraft. These observations fueled a chain of gossip, and small doubts quickly escalated into collective panic. The system of denunciation played a critical role in cementing witch fear within society. People could denounce their neighbors, the authorities, or to the church and courts to lessen their own fears or guilt. Such accusations were often rooted in personal conflicts, jealousy, or old grudges. For instance, the illness of a cow or the loss of crops might be enough to accuse a neighbor of witchcraft. Paranoia was not limited to individual suspicion. It became collective in small villages. People created an informal system of surveillance where everyone constantly watched and monitored each other. Eyes were always on the neighbor. Ears were always on rumors. In such an environment, the smallest difference or unusual act could spark suspicion. A woman walking alone at night, an elderly person gathering herbs, or a widow living in isolation. All could easily be seen as potential witches. In this atmosphere, trust eroded almost entirely. Even neighbors could no longer rely on one another. Everyday relationships unfolded under the shadow of observation and denunciation. This social paranoia ensured that witch hunts spread rapidly and endured for so long. Once a culprit was identified, fear, anger, and social pressure were channeled into a single point, temporarily preserving the community's sense of order in the face of disaster. The chain of suspicion, denunciation, and paranoia was one of the key forces that turned hunts into a social phenomenon. These mechanisms not only fed fear, but also created a cultural and psychological framework that set people against one another. By then, medieval peasants were no longer only afraid of nature and fate. They had also learned to fear the shadow of their own neighbors. In medieval Europe, witch hunts were not merely accusations. They became ritualistic performances where the fears and anger of society was laid bare. These hunts stretched from the dusty streets of small villages to the crowded squares of great cities, from stone-walled towns to isolated hamlets on the edges of forests. Every setting overflowed with a mix of fear, paranoia, and a distorted sense of justice. People did not simply seek out the guilty. They projected their fears, their rage, and their despair into these spaces. In small villages, accusations often began not in courtrooms, but in the village square. Narrow, dusty streets, wooden cottages, and stone walls became the stage where suspicions echoed. The square was a social center of the community. Everyone knew one another. Gossip and whispers circulated endlessly. Villagers carefully watched for unusual behavior, and even the smallest mistake could spark suspicion of witchcraft. Sometimes the accused was interrogated in front of her own home, trapped between the whispers of neighbors, their accusations, and their fearful glances. In these squares, the condemned was humiliated not just before court, but before the eyes of the entire community, turned into the target of collective judgment. Silence would be broken by whispers or shouts, each voice carrying both accusation and warning. In large cities, witch hunts became far more dramatic and terrifying. City squares overflowed with crowds gathered under the shadows of stone buildings. Accusations read aloud for all to hear. Here, the public was not only a witness, but a participant in deciding the witch's fate. The gallows, erected in the center, or the fires prepared for burning, stood as both symbols of justice and markers of fear. As executions unfolded, the people experienced a tangled storm of emotions: fear, curiosity, moral lesson, and at times even entertainment. The screams of women, the roar of flames, the silence or growls of the crowd, all amplified the theatrical power of the hunt. Courtrooms, meanwhile, embodied the official and legal face of witch hunts. Thick stone walls, dim lights, and cold floors intensified the weight of accusations. Here, not only villagers, but also officials and priests took the stage, weaving religious and ritualistic rhetoric to prove collusion with the devil. Women, men, and the elderly alike were interrogated, sometimes held for hours or days under crushing pressure. Torture was used not only to extract confessions, but also to deepen fear and establish control over society. Hot irons, water trials, and the breaking will did more than wound the body. They scarred collective memory, leaving everyone who watched both warned and terrified. The places of the witch hunts shaped social psychology. The wooden square of a village made suspicion between neighbors visible, while city executions symbolize a preservation of public order in these spaces. People not only tremble with fear, but reassure themselves of their safety and beliefs. When witches were punished, evil was destroyed, order restored, and the church's authority reaffirmed. Each location functioned as both a visible and invisible tool of social control. Every setting amplified the drama of the witch hunts. The village square became a stage where even an innocent woman could be condemned. The city square, the grand theater of fear and authority. The courtroom, the official record of guilt. Wherever a witch stood, she became the focal point of society's collective fear, rage, and paranoia. Taken together, these spaces made witch hunts not just accusations, but physical expressions of communities' deepest anxieties and prejudices. And so, witches lived on the wooden and stone textures of medieval Europe, both real and imagined threats in the eyes of the people. Every corner, every square, every courtroom became a stage for fear, paranoia, and anger. Etched forever in memory as theaters of horror, these places stood not only for crime, but for the fear and fragile order that shaped society. In medieval Europe, accusations of witchcraft were never just whispered warnings or passing rumors. For the accused, they became real and agonizing trials. Torture was an inseparable part of witch hunts, not only punishing the alleged guilty, but also shaping society through fear and discipline. Torture chambers ranged from the cold stone rooms of court buildings to the dusty sun-scorched grounds of village squares. Each corner became a stage for both suffering and distorted justice. These places were designed as dramatic arenas, testing not only the body of the accused, but the fragile psychology of the community itself. The methods of torture were extensive, both physically and psychologically. The water ordeal, the breaking wheel, hot irons, chains, and broken bones all tore apart not only flesh, but spirit. In the water test, if the accused floated, she was a witch. If she sank, she was innocent. This cruel paradox was as much psychological torment as it was physical. People feared not only the pain, but the injustice itself, watching as a line between guilt and innocence blurred into nothing. Courtrooms witnessed the most dramatic scenes of torture. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, dim candlelight, and cold floors heightened the dread. Every step taken by the accused was met with uncertainty and fear. The court, priests, and local officials worked together, blending legal and religious authority to force confessions. Confessions were extracted not only by pain, but by relentless psychological pressure. The accused was threatened with eternal damnation, forced to believe her soul was doomed. This constant terror broke people long before their bodies gave way. Most confessions were false. Innocent people, unable to withstand the agony, declared themselves guilty. Some admitted to imagined crimes, while others were forced to accuse neighbors and loved ones. This system deliberately reinforced collective paranoia, embedding fear into public memory and strengthening the myth of witchcraft. The accused became both a victim of torture and a symbol of paranoia, embodying society's deepest fears. Every confession confirmed the people's terror and cemented the witch in collective consciousness. From a psychological standpoint, torture was one of the most powerful tools of the witch hunts. Spectators learned lessons in fear. A woman's scream of confession in the square echoed as a warning to her neighbors, while mass executions in city squares served as public lessons in discipline. People believe that by watching these gruesome rituals, they were witnessing evil being punished and God's justice prevailing. The spectacle showed that witch hunts were never just individual tragedies, but social experiments and psychological warfare. Every instrument of torture carried symbolic meaning. Chains represented both physical and spiritual imprisonment. The breaking will symbolized human helplessness before divine will. The water ordeal and other trials made sin and guilt visible in the eyes of the community. These methods were not aimed solely the accused by the audience. They conveyed the message that God sees evil and punishes it, and that pain was the price of restoring order when society strayed from village squares to grand urban executions. Torture solidified the dramatic and didactic dimension of witch hunts. A woman's scream in a village square warned her neighbors. A mass execution in a city square sent a larger message of fear and obedience. Courtrooms, meanwhile, provided the official and documented proof of guilt. Each space contributed to collective embedding of fear and prejudice into the community's unconscious. Torture and confessions were never scenes of justice, but of fear and bias. Humanity's deepest anxieties and helplessness became physical realities in these places. Every scream, every drop of sweat, every tearful confession strengthened the terror of witchcraft, preparing the fate of the next victim. This fear was not only an individual trauma, but a collective psychological legacy passed down through generations. And so the tortured chambers and places of confession became the epicenters of fear, tightening their grip over medieval Europe. They disciplined society while keeping it in a constant state of dread. Every scream, every surge of anger, every beat of sweat carved witchcraft deeper into memory, ensuring that the hunts were never just trials of individuals, but manifestations of communities, fear, beliefs, and paranoia. The 16th century is remembered as a period in medieval Europe in which hunts reached their most intense and systematic peak. During this century, Europe was shaken by economic crisis, outbreaks of plague, religious reforms, and political upheavals. As society lived in a state of uncertainty and fear, witches became the tangible targets of these anxieties. Every disaster, whether crop failure, plague, or other epidemics, had to be explained by peasants and townsfolk to make sense of events beyond their control. People turned to the idea of an invisible yet powerful enemy. Famines, plagues, and wars were seen as uncontrollable disasters. In times of drought, the fields withered, crops burned, and herds starved. Plagues swept through villages and towns, wiping out large portions of the population. Wars ravaged farmland and settlements, destroying both shelter and livelihoods. People came to believe that behind these catastrophes lurked a hidden enemy. Witches emerged as that invisible but powerful threat thought to be the hand that wither crops, spread disease, and fuel conflicts. Beings whose supernatural power threatened the very order of society. By the 16th century, witchcraft accusations were no longer confined to village suspicion. They were systematically recorded in city courts and official documents. Records reveal that witch hunts had grown beyond private fears into social and legal phenomena. Courts, priests, and local authorities applied specific procedures to investigate and punish alleged witches. Confessions were extracted through torture and interrogation, and condemned were executed. These processes did not merely punish individuals, they reinforced collective fear and strengthened the authority of a church. During this time, witch hunts reached their cultural and social climax. Fear of witches entered the center of daily life. Peasants and townsfolk believed that behind every disaster lurked witchcraft. This paranoia fueled suspicion and normalized a culture of fear. Witches were not only individuals accused of crimes, they became symbols of society's attempt to defend itself against uncertainty. Crises and calamities kept fear alive. Each new famine, epidemic, or conflict reignited the terror of witches. In 1486, the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, laid the theoretical and practical foundations for witch hunts, deeply shaping by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. The book described in detail the nature of witches, their methods, and their dangers before God. It legitimized witchcraft accusations on both religious and legal grounds. The Malleus Maleficarum systematically presented the idea that witches collaborated with the devil harmed society and led innocent people into catastrophe. It served as a handbook for priests, judges, and local leaders, providing procedures for identifying, interrogating, and punishing witches. Its emphasis on women as primary suspects reinforced social prejudices and gave witch hunts a dangerous sense of legitimacy. Through this literature, witchcraft accusations ceased to be mere folklore or whispers of gossip. They became documented, systematic practices carried out in official courts. The Malleus Maleficarum became both a religious and judicial manual, serving as an authoritative guide. During the height of witch hunts in the 16th and 17th centuries, the climax of the 16th century witch hunts was not confined to literature. It manifested in large-scale trials and mass executions. In regions such as Germany, Switzerland, France, and Scotland, hundreds of people were accused of witchcraft, most condemned to die by burning. These collective trials showed that witch hunts had grown beyond isolated accusations into full-scale social disasters. For instance, the witch trials held in Würzburg and Bamberg during the 1580s drew attention for their vast scope, encompassing hundreds of defendants. Women, men, the elderly, and even children faced charges of witchcraft. Accusations were often fueled by local gossip, the influence of religious authorities, and procedures drawn directly from the Malleus Maleficarum. Executions took place before the eyes of the public, reinforcing the message of fear and discipline across society. Mass trials not only punish individuals, they spread the fear of witches throughout entire communities, forging a collective psychology of terror. Executions gave physical form to the idea of witchcraft, reinforcing popular belief, consolidating the church's authority, and strengthening the power of local rulers. For this reason, the witch hunts of the 16th century stand out as one of Europe's most terrifying and systematic social phenomena in history. In medieval Europe, those declared witches were often individuals who stood at the margins of society, marked as different in various ways. They were not merely random victims, but living reflections of collective fears and prejudices. Those branded as witches were frequently elderly women, the poor, widows living alone, and people who defied social norms. Society perceived such individuals as both powerless and dangerous. Their differences were seen as outward signs of invisible threats. Their behaviors or lifestyles, when combined with folklore and imagination of people, gave rise to a frightening image. They were not only individuals but also symbols, shaped by society in times of uncertainty, disaster, and despair. Elderly women and the poor. Elderly women were among the primary targets of witchcraft accusations. In the eyes of society, old age represented not only physical weakness, but also mystery and vulnerability. Many elderly women lived alone, often on the outskirts of villages, leading independent lives and supporting themselves. This independence could stir both envy and fear, leaving them exposed to witchcraft accusations. Poor women and those lacking family support became easy scapegoats in the face of any misfortune. Hunger, sickness, or the sudden death of livestock often turned into accusations against these vulnerable women. Their inability to defend themselves made them the visible embodiment of the witch stereotype. Folk healers, midwives, and keepers of herbal knowledge. Among those accused were also folk healers, midwives, and women skilled in herbal medicine. Their knowledge of healing and their use of mysterious plants linked them in the public imagination to supernatural powers. People often explain what they did not understand by branding it as witchcraft. If complications arose during childbirth, the midwife might be blamed if a healer's herbal remedies failed. She could be accused of causing harm instead of curing it beyond medicine. Some provided spiritual advice or divination, which further strengthened the association between their skills and hidden powers. Thus, folk healers and midwives, for their knowledge and independent lifestyles, were often singled out as witches. People of different faiths, religious and cultural differences also played a role in shaping accusations. Those outside Catholicism or belonging to local folk traditions were viewed as outsiders and potential threats. Behaviors not aligned with dominant religious norms were easily linked to witchcraft, and such individuals were accused of collaborating with the devil. These suspicions often arose not only from belief, but also from cultural and social isolation. Different clothing styles, unusual rituals, or incomprehensible behaviors could be enough for someone to be branded a witch. By existing outside society's safe boundaries, they became central figures in the construction of the witch image. The witch image as a reflection of fear and prejudice. The image of the witch was not shaped solely by individual actions, but also by collective fears, anxieties, and prejudices. Famine, disease, and natural disasters drove people to search for scapegoats. Witches became the embodied figures of these fears. They were believed to sour milk, sicken children, spoil harvest, and perform mysterious rituals at night. This image, fed by folklore, myths, and church sermons, became darker and more terrifying. People believed witches made pacts with the devil, wielded invisible powers, and threatened the very order society. These fears shaped collective behavior and ensured the persistence of witch accusations. Ultimately, those branded as witches were not merely individuals seen as different or weak. They became symbols of collective fear, prejudice, and helplessness. As a visible embodiment of invisible threats, they existed in medieval Europe both as real people and imagined dangers. The witch's portrait was not only a reflection of individual crime or difference, but also of societal disasters, cultural prejudices, and economic inequalities. Witches stood as figures that gave form to fear, anger, and despair, becoming some of the darkest and most unforgettable symbols of medieval history. In medieval Europe, witch hunts were not merely fear-filled tales born religious belief. They were also complex reflections of social, economic, and political dynamics. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was shaken by economic crises. Heavy taxation, epidemics, famines, and protracted wars. People felt powerless in the face of calamities such as crop failures, outbreaks of plague, sudden floods, and devastating fires. In such uncertainty, believing in a hidden enemy behind these disasters became a kind of psychological defense mechanism. Witches in the eyes of the people came to embody these invisible yet powerful threats. Yet this fear was not only the product of individual anxieties. Feudal lords, city officials, and the church strategically exploited these fears for their own gain. Witch hunts became a powerful tool for enforcing social control and reinforcing political and religious authority. Witch hunts not only revealed social inequalities and class conflicts, but also served as a means of redistributing resources. Widows living alone, independent farmers, women with property, or those dwelling outside village boundaries were seen as potential threats to the social and economic order. For example, a widow who worked her own land and sustained herself independently drew suspicion both for her economic self-sufficiency and her defiance of social norms. Accusations of witchcraft became a means to seize the property of such individuals and silence those who lived outside traditional structures. At the same time, hunts served to strengthen solidarity among villagers, preserve hierarchical order, and enforce social balance through fear. Economic rivalry also played a role. If one farmer's harvest proved more abundant than another's, or if a healer's remedies became highly sought after, envy and resentment could easily be transformed into accusations of witchcraft. Thus, witch hunts became mechanisms not only of personal conflict, but also of reshaping economic power balances. The Church's role was not limited to framing witchcraft as a spiritual danger. It also used witch hunts strategically to reinforce feudal authority and ecclesiastical power. They became instruments to discipline the populace, punish the dissenters, and strengthen religious norms. Priests and local rulers spread the belief that witches were in league with the devil, thereby consolidating their own authority while instilling widespread fear and obedience. In regions where religious reform and sectarian conflict were intense, witch fear served to unify communities and reinforce feudal order. This demonstrates that witch hunts were not merely outbreaks of popular panic, but deliberate strategies of political and religious power. Those who thought independently, lived differently, or defied tradition were silenced through witchcraft accusations. This mechanism not only fueled fear but also maintained social order by turning invisible threats into tangible enemies. Witch hunts kept both individuals and communities in line. As people witnessed witches being punished, they disciplined themselves, conforming to rules of church and feudal authority. Accusations became a method of enforcing conformity, punishing those who stray from norms and ensuring collective obedience, silencing difference. Thus reinforced order in villages and towns, becoming a tool of control. In the end, witch hunts were not solely prized of religious belief, but integral parts of a complex mechanism that upheld social hierarchy, regulated economic power, and sustained political authority. Witch fears both reflected inner anxieties and served as tools for the powerful. Witches stood not only as symbols of terror, but also as visible instruments of social control, economic regulation, and political authority, leaving a deep and unforgettable mark on history as multi-layered historical phenomena. Witch hunts profoundly shaped the psychological, social, and economic fabric of early modern Europe. By the late 17th century, however, Europe began to undergo a profound transformation in thought. This new period, known as the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, radically changed how people understood nature, society, and human behavior. Scientific methods, observation, and experimentation began to replace traditional explanations. Disasters, plagues, and natural catastrophes were no longer seen solely as acts of divine wrath or the work of witches' spells, but rather as results of natural laws and human influence. Advances in astronomy, physics, medicine, and chemistry build a strong intellectual foundation against fear and superstition. Figures like Galileo, Newton, and Vesalius explained the workings of the universe with evidence and reason. Eclipses, storms, and epidemics came to be regarded as natural events rather than signs of demonic forces. Among the educated classes in the urban bourgeoisie, rational thought became the guide to life, and fear of witches began to fade. The rise of scientific approaches also undermined the legal and social foundations of witch hunts. Courts began questioning the validity of confessions, extracted under torture, and considered natural explanations for misfortunes. The era when mere accusations serve as evidence gave way to more rational, evidence-based legal processes. Witch hunts, once justified as means of protecting social order, no longer carried persuasive power. By the 18th century, witch hunts had all but vanished. Witch trials became rare, and most people no longer believed in such charges in Western Europe, particularly in England, Germany, and France. Witchcraft accusations and mass executions receded into the dark pages of history. Science and reason replaced superstition, and natural phenomena were now explained through observation and logic. The end of the hunts was not only a legal or social shift, but also a transformation in people's inner worlds. Communities move away from fear-driven rituals and paranoia. Witches, once terrifying figures in everyday life, survived only in folk tales and legends. Yet, the trauma and fear left by the hunts continue to echo in cultural memory for centuries. With the Enlightenment, the fear-driven world of medieval Europe collapsed. Rational thought, observation, and science reshaped how societies explained disasters and understood difference. Witch hunts became a phenomenon of the past, relics of an age ruled by fear and superstition, while humanity stepped into a new era guided by reason and knowledge. Witch hunts left their mark on the dark era of medieval Europe, becoming one of the most striking examples in human history. This process was not only driven by beliefs and superstitions, but also by a mix of prejudice, jealousy, and economic and social conflicts. The accusation, torture, and execution of innocent people clearly demonstrated the destructive impact of fear on individuals and societies. Witches became not a real threat, but tangible symbols of people's own fears, anxieties, and helplessness in the face of the unknown. History shows that witch hunts were not merely a tragedy of specific period. They also revealed the darker sides of human nature. Fear and prejudice could turn people against one another, divide societies, and undermine a sense of justice. In this era where innocence was disregarded, people approached each other with suspicion rather than trust, and paranoia prevailed over solidarity. This dark legacy can be seen as a precursor to recurring social behaviors and mass fears throughout history. Today, even though witches no longer exist physically, the targets of fear continue to persist. Societies often tend to blame what is different, unknown, or beyond their control. Therefore, the history of witch hunts is not just a tragedy of the past, but also a warning for the present and future. When fear is left unchecked, it can lead people away from their values, strengthen prejudices, and cause injustice. In conclusion, the legacy of witch hunts reminds us that humanity can transform fear with reason, prejudice with knowledge, and helplessness with solidarity. Witches may change, methods may change, times may change, but the targets of fear can exist in every era. What matters is remaining brave, conscious, and just in the face of these fears. And now, after thousands of voices lost in darkness and lived fears throughout history, a final message to our audience. While gaze at the shadows of the past, never lose your own light. Good night.